Elrond might be one of the most underrated tier 3 commanders in the game right now. I don't have Elrond recruited, but my buddy Lord Bearstrike was kind enough to send me some reports from his and give me permission to make a video about that commander, as it's one of his favorites in the game. So this video is going to be an Elrond guide. Right quick before we get into it though, if you guys have a favorite commander that you want to see a video about, please hop into my Discord. There should be a link in the description below and let me know. It is very difficult in this game to recruit every single commander, equip every single commander, have them at the right respect level and all of those things. Pretty much impossible to cover every commander in the game by myself, but there's a lot of guides I would love to make, and if I can get your guys' help, maybe we can get a guide for every single commander in the game. Let's get into today's. All right, we'll start things off by taking a look at a report. Please bear with me a little bit, as these are just screenshots. I'm not on the same server as Lord Bearstrike, so I don't have access to the reports in game. But here we have him going up against a Theoden that is 4 levels higher than his Elrond, and this Theoden is bringing an army that has a whopping almost 415,000 HP. We can check out the damage breakdown here. Elrond's soldiers doing 326, almost 327,000 damage. That is an absolutely ridiculous amount of damage. And this Theoden is bringing 2 different T4 units into the fight. The Theoden's gear is not perfect by any means, but it's also not terrible. And it's relatively even with this Elrond's gear. Elrond does have a bit of a gear advantage. However, the Theoden did have a level advantage, so I think it is somewhat relatively equal there. And we can also take a look at the skill build real quick. I will be able to pull the skill build up in game, but if anybody wants to take a second to go ahead and screenshot it so that you can save it for later and use it for yourself, be my guest. Moving on, let's go ahead and talk about the skill build. I would say one of the most important skills for Elrond is the ever powerful convener ability. For the first 2 rounds, this is going to give your army a chance to gain well, I guess you always get the initiative and then you get the chance to gain follow-up for those first 2 rounds. This allows you to do an incredible amount of burst damage and I think is completely optimal for Elrond. You do have to put 14 or 15 points into Lord of Imladris in order to put the full 7 into Convener. However, this isn't as bad of a skill as I think it gets some credit for. It's only a 1-round cooldown, which means it goes off on rounds 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. And you can make it prioritize ranged units, and the current metagame, at least in Tactics Evolved, relies heavily on ranged units for both good and evil factions, so having a skill that can snipe some ranged units is not a bad thing by any means. Additionally, you will want to pick up Valias Ringbearer if you have Elrond at R5. This is because you're going to be using a full Elven army on this guy, and this provides a nice buff to your Elven units. You don't necessarily have to put all 15 points into this, as the max level effect of 15 focus is nothing exciting. However, the 15th point will still give you more damage, and because Elrond is a support commander, he is not nearly as strapped on skill points as some other commanders. And then you're definitely going to want to pick up the half-elven tree as well as Boon. So basically what's happening for Elrond is you have a coin flip's chance to gain damage from Boon. Then if you're running 3 elven units, which you should be on this guy, all of your army is going to get a 30% damage bonus from half elven. And then all of your elven units are going to get even more of a damage bonus from Valias Ringbearer. And you have follow-up, potentially, most likely, for the first 2 rounds. All in all, this build gives you an absurd amount of burst damage during those early rounds of combat, and you still have solid damage bonuses after that. For any extra skill points, I think there's an argument that could be made for putting them into Coalition, just so you have a chance to gain initiative, which will be helpful if you're fighting like cavalry armies, which are going to be faster than you. I think there's a reasonable argument for Rush as well, as it is just a 1-round cooldown skill that also has Rush. And it's just going to let Elrond himself do a little bit of extra damage, and you're already putting 14 or 15 points into Imladris itself, so it is efficient in that regard. If you're fighting evil factions, you could pick up Starlight, since you already have points in Velia's Ringbearer. Starlight's basically just a worse Champion of the Light, slightly different mechanically, but I think Champion is pretty much strictly better. You could also opt just to put some points into White Council to give yourself some amount of damage mitigation. However, Elrond is pretty much a glass cannon style commander. He really wants to kill stuff before it kills him. So unless you can put a ton of points into White Council, I think those points would probably be spent elsewhere. Moving on, we can talk about some equipment options for Elrond. I'm going to pretend that my Arwen is Elrond. Like I said, I don't have Elrond. However, they're both elves, meaning they have access to the same equipment options. By far, the best weapon you can get is an elven white knife. If possible, you will want this with the Might of Elves effect. However, this can be a difficult thing for a lot of players, so I think a Mirkwood bow is certainly a reasonable option. You'll probably want to get an elf strength Mirkwood bow. You're most likely going to be running 2 ranged units on Elrond anyway. The elf strength will be slightly better than ranged might because you're going to be running heralds as well. If you want to run like keepers and heralds, you could potentially look at a melee might cutlass. I don't know if I have a melee might cutlass lying around, but that would be an option. However, I think in general, if you can't get the white knife, you're probably going to want to go with the bow because it's going to be usable as pretty much any faction, whereas the keepers are mostly specific to Lindon and Arnor. In terms of the chest slot, I think you have a few good options. I think a hunter skin with ranged figure, since you're probably going to be running double ranged unit. I think that is perfectly reasonable. I think that a quilted armor with focus protection is always a good thing to have in your back pocket in case you're fighting things like Sauron, Gandalf the White. Galadriel focus protection effect can be very useful to have for the right combats. As far as a gold item goes, Ranger's Shroud, giving even more army attack, is for your ranged units is definitely a good option as well. And you could always go with something like a Scale Mail just to give your heralds a bit more durability. It's going to give them some defense, and you can get the melee vigor trait on it. Plus, it gives you some extra might to help maximize damage in the early rounds of combat. For the helm slot, I think a Trapper's Hood is a very reasonable choice, even more army attack for those ranged units to maximize that burst damage. You could also run a Resolve Horseman's Helm so that your army does not blow itself up in those convener rounds. This could be an item that you just swap to as needed, though. Having a maxed out Resolve Horseman's Helm is just a great item to be able to pass around to whatever commanders could potentially be running into, like a Frodo and Sam bomb or a Madness Sauron, potentially even Grima. But I think overall, those two would be the best choice. If you have access to gold items, I don't have an Aegis Cask of the Submerged Isle or Hunter's Guide. Those would probably be the absolute best in slot options, as Aegis will give you protection from stuns and madness, and that helm is just absolutely bananas. And then for the equipment slot, unfortunately, Elrond cannot run the Wizard's Fireworks, but you can get a Harp of Lothlorien with Elf Strength. That is definitely a very solid option for you as well. The other attribute on the harp that you might want to consider would be Hunter's Mark. This will help you in the matchups against Gil-galad, Gandalf the Grey, Grima. There's a lot of avoidance running around in the metagame right now, so you might get more value out of Hunter's Mark rather than straight up the Elf Strength. And if you don't have either of those, Sustain Pipe is like pretty much good on every single commander possible. Amend Hithlane might even be an option to consider. You could even get something crazy like a Bane of Orcs Hithlane if you're having a bunch of trouble with evil factions running like tons of Arbalests or Reapers. I definitely think that Elrond has quite a lot of potential accessory slots, because basically what you'll want to do, in my opinion, is figure out like what trait on your accessory do you need. Do you need Pursuit? Pick up Hunter's Mark Harp. Do you need a beefier army? You might want to pick up the Hithlane for the army HP. Do you just need some sustainability? Maybe you take the pipe with sustain. although I would shy away from that. Like I was saying earlier in the video, Elrond isn't really a sustain hero, but a lot of good accessory options out there still. Just kind of figure out which one is best for you based on what you're fighting. And then as far as an army goes, it is super straightforward. I don't even know why I'm going to my barracks or my army screen like I can actually equip any of these units, as I don't have any heralds or anything trained right now. But pretty much what you want to do is pick 3 elven units, throw them in there. I would say Bow Knights, Sentinels, and Heralds are the most straightforward option. If you are Lothlorien, definitely replace the Bow Knights with March Wardens. If you have access to Keepers, you can throw them in as well. But pretty much his entire build revolves around those elven units. So that's the army that you're going to want to use. And that's it for this video, guys. Thank you for watching.